Hi, everybody. We will have the LiveSound panel out here in just a minute. They're just getting mic'd up right now. When I was asked to do this, and then when I found out I was the moderator, two separate occasions, but anyway, I started thinking about the direction that we wanted to take this, and one of them was the history of LiveSound, and I think a bigger part of it that we're really going to try and address is where are we at today? Because between those 2 points is a very, 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 very long, kind of twisted path. But while the guys are getting mic'd up backstage, I'll just give you a little refresher, a little idea of what it was like about 40 years ago. 40 years ago, PA systems were a collection of mix and match boxes that if you were lucky, you actually got to pick what you were going to mix and what you were going to match. And most of the time, you were just handed the keys to somebody's truck and said, it's all in there. And the mixing and matching, okay, great, Trevor Nash is here. The mixing and matching was just something you had to deal with. And all of the components were separate components. You didn't have something like this, like a full-range speaker. You had bass bins, as we called them, bass cabinets, mid-range cabinets, high-frequency horns, tweeters, sometimes not. To anybody that's used to using a program for doing their line array calculations will appreciate that at the time, if you wanted to aim a 90-degree horn, which is what we mostly had, you went like this, and you went, yeah, that's about covering the audience. And there were other things like a popular mid-range cabinet was the JBL 4560. And the reason it was a mid-range cabinet was because it wouldn't produce any useful bass, and it wouldn't produce any high end. So therefore, it was a mid-range cabinet. The fact that it had no way of coupling the 15-inch speaker to the horn walls of the cabinet didn't really factor into things at the time because nobody could do anything about it. But anyway, so that's just a little bit of a taste of what it was like 40 years ago in terms of putting up PA systems. Everybody had a different way of doing it. Everybody had different amplifiers. Everybody had different drivers in the same speakers. And there was a whole lot of trial and error. And if you were good at it, you know, maybe you could get it to sound like something. And a lot of times, you know, people went out, they drank their beer, they went home. Did it sound good? I don't know. But now, I think that we're actually in a time when there is literally no excuse for bad sound at a live event. The problems have, for the most part, been solved. The technology is there to make it possible. And with that, I'm going to introduce the panel. You must be Trevor Nash.
Yes, I am.
We haven't met before. It's Trevor Nash from D&B. Look at that. My pack is falling off. Trevor Nash from D&B, is it acoustics? Is that
D&B
Audio Technic, right, okay. And beside him, David Serene from Caesar's Palace in Windsor, Mark Radu from Solotech, Bob Snellgrove from Gare Audio, and Rob Sandelowich from Westbury National Show Systems. So to start off, guys, we talked about, let's just briefly touch on like kind of what was the first sound system that you dealt with in a professional way, like outside of your bedroom. You want to start with that, Trevor?
Oh, jump right into it. So I started back as a co-op student at Rocky Mountain Sound, I guess in 1998. And the first sound system was the bottom of the totem pole, was Martin W. bins with Philishave mids and JBL 2445 horns, I believe. Big stack of time alignment through stacking and everything like that, and mixed crossovers and various amplifiers.
David?
One of the first ones I worked on was actually 20 years ago, starting at Caesars Windsor. It was called Casino Windsor back then. I used to mix in a room with 230 people. And it was a pair of EAW LA 325s, and with single 18, and these were point source boxes, trapezoid, and ended up putting some apogees in the back for delay, but that was it. That was the first PA.
You're a late starter.
Yeah.
Mark?
I go back to the butterfly bins, the 15s and 12s with the ATC.
From
long
Kahlua
coil.
Music, those
Yes.
ones, right? Yep, I was
Yeah.
thinking about those.
The M600 Philips Shave mids and the JBL biradial horns powered by the MOSFET V800 amplifiers from H&H.
The H&H.
Fixed card BSS crossover.
Yep, yeah, you
Like
had,
life was good when you had an SPX 90 in the rack. And
there you go, yeah. Bob?
I go back to a product made by Electro Voice, a Century 4. It was never designed to be moved. It was supposed to be hung up in the air somewhere. It had a very fragile foam core horn that worked reasonably well, had a little tweeter that worked reasonably well. And it had a bass bin that was made out of particle board. So it all had to be taken apart, fiberglassed, handles had to be put on it, driven by BGWs at 2 ohms. They weren't supposed to be run at 2 ohms. You could run them at 2 ohms, but well, that was the first.
Wow. Rob?
I think maybe those boxes were fiberglassed in our shop before my time.
Not your shop at the time.
Yeah.
They were.
But yeah, my first touring job was in the late 70s, and we had those 4560s you're talking about. But we were using them as bass bins because we had a 2-way PA to begin with. And we had the JBL 2350 horns over it with 40 drivers, I guess before the 41s came out. And eventually we added, I guess we went and talked to Bob, and we added Martin bass bins, added the Philips shaves after a while, and we were doing large venues with this stuff, but there was no real bass in the 4560s, like Ike said, and that really frustrated me.
And I would say that it's probably a pretty good bet that at least Mark and Rob and I have hearing damage in the range of what an SM58 through a JBL 23 anything horn with a 24 anything driver on it in a bar at about head height.
Especially a 2482 driver, the phenolic one that could peel paint at...
This is what we used to talk about over beers, was the various qualities of various drivers that would take your head off for the most part. So that gives you an idea of kind of what I'm not really going to call them the dark ages, but what the early times of doing live sound in and around Ontario. Many of us worked for what were called 401 bands, which were called 401 bands because we played from Windsor to Montreal and, Trenton, places usually just on or off the 401. If you were lucky. If you were not lucky, you were up in Northern Ontario paying your dues. Yes, Paul.
Could I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
We've sort of talked about loudspeakers a bit,
Yeah.
but there's a chain, and back in the day, that chain also was morphing pretty quickly.
That's true. That's a good point. And what it started to morph to, probably the first morph that happened was Meyer Sound, which Bob brought to Ontario and to Canada. And they were the beginning of more of a system approach where they made all of the components, they were all made to go together. They had specific recommendations for specific amplifiers, and they had specific processors that were needed to work with the speaker. Take it away, Bob.
Thank you. So maybe we could go back across the line here.
Yeah.
And what kind of mixing console, what kind of crossover, what kind of power amps, anything about that chain that sort of struck you, maybe go back down the line that way.
So back to me.
Yeah.
I guess mixing console in first one I encountered would be an old Soundcraft 200B with the classic patch bay on the side, studio style to be able to patch your outboard rack. And if you were lucky, you had an SPX 90 or maybe a D1500 delay if you were super lucky. And then after that, I guess that was in the era of the early Crest in the early on. And BSS crossovers, if you were lucky, you were able to have the faceplate was off and you were able to adjust it if you had the right screwdriver with you.
So some of the amps that were driving that LA 325s was Carver's 1450s and some 900s. And I had a DBX 4800 drive rack and Sonic Maximizer 362. So nothing too outstanding.
Yeah, no, I
And
don't
the,
take
the
it the wrong
console,
way, but it's
the
like,
console was a Mackie, which we quickly got rid of real quick, and just went to a GL 4000 Allen Heath.
What's wrong with the Mac?
I'll just say something about Mackie. There's a lot of people find it as popular to slag Mackie, but when that product came out,
Which one? Which one?
well, the 1202 or the 1402 or any of the early Mackies or just the Mackie console line in general, as somebody that was managing a sound company at the time, it was a real problem if you had a professional client, like an AV type client, that you had the main room and you were going to put your big console in there, your PM2000 or whatever, and you had to do breakout rooms. It was a real problem to come up with a small mixer that was reliable enough and professional enough and quiet enough that you could use for a client that was paying tens of thousands of dollars for sound reinforcement for their event. And the Mackie was really the first console in an affordable price range that you could do that. There were small Sony consoles, there were small Studer consoles that were made, small Neve consoles that were made for broadcast that cost $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 for like a 12 or 16 channel. So Mackie was really the first reliable, quiet, clean console that you could use on those kinds of jobs and not feel like you were A, getting away with something, or B, ripping the client off. So anyway, Mark.
I guess I go back to the Soundcraft 1S, that you could go in with a soldering iron and make the auxes pre or post, depending on what your application of the day was.
Yeah.
Had the D1500, SPX 90. What were those Yamaha gates, the 2020s?
Oh yeah,
I
yeah.
think,
The compressor gate. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. GC 2020.
I think that was it. And then DBX compressors, and life was good then. That was about the top of the food chain.
Yeah. Bob.
So my recollection in terms of consoles is the same Soundcraft was really a kind of a breakthrough. It was had quite a few channels and interesting things about it. It was reliable. And moving on from there, I think there was a shift. This was all pre-digital, so we're well before 1980. So any of you guys who have mentioned any gizmo that's digital or time delay, this is well before that. But going to electronic crossovers was a big step. And someone mentioned phenolic drivers on a JBL. My recollection of that is a battle that was taking place right across the industry at the time, where we just didn't have any reliability. So using compression drivers crossed over at 500 hertz, which was recommended. Then that became 800 hertz. And then some of you will recall that it became 1200 hertz. And they would blow up at 500 right away. They would blow up at 800 shortly thereafter. 1200 hertz is where they all, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, so, it wouldn't reproduce any lower frequencies or higher frequencies. I think that's what you were talking about. So, so I think the evolution of the electronic crossover in system design was reasonably significant.
Yeah, and don't forget, the most important part for me, being just a slight bit younger than you, was when we went from 12 dB per octave crossovers to 24 dB per octave slopes. And that really cleaned things up a lot. It was a huge leap forward getting into the BSS stuff. And I know Select had the 18 dB slopes on theirs, but it made a huge difference when you cross something over at 1.2K and it was only 12 dB per octave. You were really not giving your drivers that much of a break.
That was the Lindquist Riley. Lindquist and Riley came up with cascaded 12 dB per octave filters, and it was Chas Brooke Siren, that put a limiter in between the two. So that also really massively improved reliability.
But I think we were sort of tinkerers back in that era, in that we would take the best of make the best of a bad situation. We'd go into a venue, a club, and the sound system was always terrible. And your job was to make it sound as good as possible. And sometimes your EQ curves looked ridiculous. Nowadays, we're used to having a process system out of the box that sounds good, ready to go. But back then, it was really, we were EQing not only for frequency response, we were EQing harsh frequencies out of the PA, distortion out of the PA systems.
Yeah, cabinet problems and so on.
Cabinet resonances, yeah.
Still on the console thing, I was a Yamaha guy from pretty early on because that's what the rental place in Prince Edward Island, where I grew up, started, had available. And the PM700 12-channel mixer was my axe. And I would make bands that I was working for get one. And I also owned a PM180, which was a 6-channel rack mount thing. I used to put my drums in there and everything else in the PM700. It was 18 channels. It was pretty rocking. And also, that stuff was super reliable, except for one little flaw that the Yamahas had. It had a little occasional amplifier would blow up inside them. But other than that, on the mixer front and also the crossover front, Bob, you made your own mixers and you made your own crossovers here in Toronto, over there on Jarvis Street, I believe.
Yeah, my first shop was Westbury Sound's first shop, 107 Jarvis Street, right beside the Jarvis house. And yeah, we did make crossovers for a while and some mixing consoles.
Yep, they made, he's being modest, they made one of the first monitor consoles that I ever saw, and never mind used, was the Gear 10x4, which is a rack mount unit about yay big, 10 channels, 4 mixes. They could be cascaded to be 20x4. I don't remember ever going further than that. I don't remember if they could. And there was also, was this a one? Was the 18x7 a one-off?
Oh, it was a one-off. Yeah.
Yeah. That one had faders on it, and that was like, you were the man if you were operating that. I did bands like Girls' School and the Joe Perry Project at the El Macombo did monitors on that console. So
I toured with that console with Blue Peter for years, doing up to 10,000, 15,000 people at Ontario Place, 10x4 on monitor mix, if you could imagine. Yeah. But I remember when we bought the Midas console, the 26-channel console, my brother and I bought this board. It was a fortune. It was Pro 4. And we were convinced that we would never need a bigger mixing board, because how could you ever need 26 channels, odd amount, but how could you ever need more than 26 channels? We were totally convinced we'd never need a bigger board.
I have a question from management. How much time is this panel? I haven't seen the... What? Keep going. Yeah, I'm going to keep... I wasn't going to wrap, Anthony. I was just... I just want to...
It was a,
I want to not have this be a bunch of old farts talking about the old days without getting to the new days and what's actually happening now, because that's really what's important. Is it an hour, 90 minutes? What? Okay, all right, so we got to fill. No,
so.
all right, yeah.
I was just going to say, I saw Dan Umbercat out here, there, wherever he is. He just walked back there. And Dan, I'm not going to try to throw you under the bus here, but one of the best sound systems that was in Ontario belonged to Dan Umbercat. And it was it was a, what was it called? The scoop, the JBL scoop with the two
4530.
with the two, what are the 12s on top? Two 12s that were right up front, and then 15s, and then the scoop, and then a multi-cell on top. But I think what Dan really nailed was power, because in those days it was very hard to get much power. There was, I think Crown came out with the DC 300.
That was in the 70s for sure. It was in the early.
No, I
mid-70s.
think it was 68.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
155 watts per channel into 8 ohms.
Yeah, exactly. It's supposed to be 150, but you know the secret. It actually does more. So power was very hard to come by, and he was using tube stuff from Germany, which Dynacord from Germany, right? And I don't know about the crossovers. They might have been even passive, but that rig sounded really, really amazing. And that's a recollection of mine from high school.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, all of those cabinets had qualities. It was the 4530 bass bin which was the scoop. It's front-loaded 15 with a kind of like a seashell kind of port that came out around it. Those things were great for kick drum, man. But there was some frequency that would turn them inside out. I remember that they all had their great qualities and they all had their downsides. And that particular cabinet had no, I guess, acoustic control over the driver over excurting. If somebody with an ARP Odyssey synthesizer opened up that filter, which we all hated as sound guys, I'll tell you, because it was big trouble.
Staying back in the 70s for a second, again, all pre-digital, I don't know how often you guys came across this. Mark, you would have, but some of the only options that we had were studio products. So you mentioned the DBX, so that was totally, what was the number of that? Do you remember?
176.
DBX 160.
They're 160, right?
The most common ones.
So that as a compressor was fabulous, and it was built reasonably well. But then there was the LA4.
But you can only afford to put one on the lead singer.
But you could only afford to put one. Yeah, it was like a Crown when it came out. You could buy a Volkswagen instead of 2 Crown DC 300s. So ridiculous.
While we're talking about the DC 300, I actually got to visit Gerald Stanley's office at Crown at Elkhart before it closed, and that was
before Harman closed it. Yeah.
That was his thesis in college, that amplifier.
Huh.
And if you go into what was his office there, it's just binders everywhere. And napkin cat is actually true. You pull out the binder for his DC 300, everything is in the plastic sleeves. And there are actual napkin drawings with the bar logo still on them of circuit schematics and stuff like that for that project.
And the other thing about the DC 300 is that the DC was an accurate description of what happens when the amp would fail, because it would fail and put the DC power supply current right out the back end and right to the speaker, which the speaker would just either go to the furthest end of its excursion this way or that way and burn up when they failed, because things like output protection on amplifiers was not what it is today by any stretch of the imagination.
Gerald was a expert, had his PhD in a related field. It's metallurgy or some silicon dynamics, and what he was studying were silicon chips. So this was his focus, because up until then we still had germanium transistors, and up until then anything that had any power was kind of used in transmitters and things like that. So that was one of the successes of that amplifier, was his meticulous research into safe operating areas of silicon, and getting the voltage current, the VI limiting, working so that the amplifier would stay within, the output transistors would stay within their safe operating area, was a feat in the age. And I do think the Crown was just before 1970, so quite revolutionary, and right beside those big bogans that would put out a couple hundred watts with 4 or 6 big output tubes. That thing weighed 300 pounds. So.
Yep. The other big power amp of the day was the Phase Linear 700, which was
700B. It was 350 watts. That's what I went to because it had more power, but it was super fragile. It was a home stereo amplifier. That's what Clare Brothers built their company on.
Entire reputation.
Phase Linear 400s.
Yeah.
We could go on about this all day. I think what we should maybe start to do is kind of move it up into the present day and maybe reference back to some of this old stuff. A couple of key points out of this, though, is one of the things is that if you were a sound technician, engineer that was charged with working with this stuff, I mean, everybody had to have at least a working knowledge of things like how to change AC plugs, how to solder, how to troubleshoot things, how to track things down, because if you were in a bar in Northern Ontario and the sound system had a problem, you had to figure it out. And I mean, even FedEx was barely a thing back then. So getting parts in a hurry was not a thing. So it was something that sort of informed this generation of people that came up through that, was, problem solving, troubleshooting, trying new things. Maybe I'll stack the contrast between, again, having your array calculator program that says what angles to put between the boxes, and being in a bar and going, well, maybe I'll put the mid cabinets beside the bass cabinets today and stack the horns and splay them like this instead of putting them side by each, which was the wrong thing to do. You got to kind of mess around with acoustics just by restacking your PA different ways, or changing which amplifier was powering which section of it and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of kind of great ways to learn back then, and not a lot of really informed critics to tell you that you were wrong. So moving on. So let's talk. Okay, so Trevor, tell us what your gig is today, because D&B is kind of out there in the forefront of line arrays and that kind of thing. So
yeah, D&B is it's been a company that started in '83, I guess. So 35 years now that they've been making sound systems, complete systems, loudspeakers and controllers in the early days, and amplifiers in today's age, it was a German company. It still is a German company. So its representative in North America didn't start till the early 2000s, and now in Canada started officially in 2006. So it's a company that's always, as we talked about some of the older days of Meyer having the first system within Canada, that's kind of where we've been from the beginning, but it was a European point before we had a presence in Canada. So my role at D&B is officially regional manager. I take care of sales and also support mostly for all of Canada, support for our systems and design for installations and live applications as well.
And David, you're like the technical supervisor at Caesars Windsor.
Yeah, I'm the
now?
house
So you have to weed your way through all these advertising brochures and salespeople and all that stuff and decide on what's the best for the job or for your application. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, right now we have a brand new A12s by JBL. It's the VTX, latest series. Before that, we had a Vertex system in the Coliseum that, when it opened, was in 2008. So we're celebrating our 10th anniversary at the moment.
So sorry to interrupt. Mark, were you guys involved in that?
Yeah, we were involved with the A12 design and installation.
Sorry.
That's okay. We're actually the first install in the world of that PA. It's been wonderful. The feedback from all the front of house engineers has been top notch, and we're just happy to have it. It's an amazing system.
Mark, what's the newest, latest? What are you up to lately?
Right now in Ottawa at the NAC, the 3 venues there, 4 new sound systems going in, all state-of-the-art, digital control, digital networking. That's the main project right now. With Solotech kind of on a global scale, so we have projects going on all over the world at any given time, and even though you're in one office, you're working on projects in other offices. So it's a different adventure every week.
Yeah. That's funny. That distributed workflow is huge these days. Like I'm the Canadian rep for Radioactive Designs Intercom, and there's about 6 of us that are the core people in the company, and we're all over North America, and it hardly matters because it's just email and phone calls and all that stuff, and the physical location of where people are in terms of work getting done is getting to be less critical than it used to be when people actually had to be physically in the same space to collaborate. Bob, what's new and fabulous?
Well, we're a distribution company, so we represent manufacturers. We've represented Digico mixing consoles for quite some time, and Clearcom intercom systems also for many years, and Meyer Sound loudspeakers for many years. And as far as new, all of these products are quite evolutionary, and I would have to say that the newest newness has to do with the technologies that are embedded inside those products. And from Meyer's point of view and from Digico's point of view, they have both successfully migrated fully away from DSP-based systems to FPGA-based systems, and that's generally speaking a very positive and a very good way to approach the technology.
Let me just let's just backtrack there for a minute. So we were all talking about all these separate speaker cabinets and racks of amplifiers, and a key component of that was crossovers, electronic crossovers. And again, there was, with very few exceptions, like for example, JBL did make their own crossovers, and if you were using JBL components, you could use the JBL crossovers and kind of have an integrated system. But most of the time you were picking a crossover from some manufacturer that, for example, didn't even build speakers, like Ashley Audio. Ashley crossovers were quite popular. And then once people had crossovers, then the issue of having their speakers blow up when they didn't want them to, which is ever, became more of an issue, and then people started looking at different protection schemes for loudspeakers. And it was everything from light bulbs in series with tweeters to various things with diodes, I think, various developments in output protection on amplifiers, and then finally limiters that were placed in various places in the system, either separate limiters or say 4 limiters in one rack space that was designed to be on the output of a 4-way crossover to, as Bob said earlier, on the Brook Siren was one of the first companies to actually to incorporate the limiters into the crossover. But you see this development going along where it's starting to have take a broader sense, a broader look at control, and to actually have the system function as a system and work reliably without blowing up if you looked at it the wrong way and that kind of thing. So, and that, sorry, I remember where I was going with this. That, in the, say, early 1990s, started to morph into DSP, digital signal processing. The SPX90 was an early digital reverb, and if you were following that product line, you started to see other products from Yamaha come out that were essentially in the same chassis, and essentially they were the same circuit board under the hood, because it was a digital device. You could say, okay, today you're a reverb, and it'd program it to be a reverb. But the next day you could say, okay, I'm sure some of the same electronics that were in the SPX90, for example, were part of the DX7 synthesizer and so on. So you could start, because these boxes, again, were basically programmable on some level, that once the companies developed the circuitry, that they could then say, okay, well, instead of being a limiter, this is going to be instead of being a reverb, this is going to be a limiter, or a delay or something else. So that was DSP. So what Bob's talking about now with these FPGA chips is that basically, like, that's the, if I getting this correctly, it's basically giving that device its programming on one chip as a out of the box kind of thing, correct? Or
when you if you were a manufacturer, if you were a chip manufacturer and you were going to manufacture a DSP, you would use FPGAs to model what you wanted the DSP to do. And when you finished figuring out what you wanted your DSP to do, this product you were manufacturing, that you were going to commit to silicon. Sorry. But you'd use the FPGA. It's a much more difficult thing to deal with. Now, I say that, and we talk about the evolution, talking about the evolution of technology. 10 or 15 years ago, in the audio business, using a large FPGA was completely revolutionary, because who was around to actually make it work? And that's the thing, very scarce group. Today, of course, you've got everyone coming out of school, and they're focusing on FPGAs. They're left DSPs behind because they know how to do it. They don't know what to do in terms of, if it was going to be specifically audio, they'd have to learn that. But in terms of being able to deal with FPGAs. So I was just saying that the sort of new stuff is based on FPGA, and that's true for Digico, and it's true for Meyer. And then the other thing that is a focus, especially with loudspeakers, is how light can they be? How less can they weigh? This is a very, very important thing, especially as the performance of a line array product, for example, well, specifically a line array product, has to do with how long that line is. The longer the line is, the more control that you're going to have. And the shorter the line is, you reach a point where you're seriously going to compromise the performance in a venue. So most venues today are built with a great deal of capacity in their ceilings, and in Canada, snow loads, et cetera. Some of the older ones, though, and as you're traveling through the States, very significant problem putting anything too heavy on rigging points. So weight is a big factor. And, you know, back in the day, I well remember designing products and looking at going to switching power supplies. They're very light. They kick off a whole bunch of high-frequency garbage. Nobody knew. Nobody was using them in audio at all. And now everyone's using them in audio. So it doesn't matter what you open up, it's going to have a little switching supply in it. So weight's important, but I think the biggest recent change that I've seen is in the networking of every device.
Yeah, we're gonna touch on that
Yeah.
in a minute. So just to finish that, so Rob, what's new and interesting? What are you working on lately? That's or how does you know? I've been remiss in not quite introducing everybody as to what they actually do. So Trevor represents D&B loudspeakers in Canada. David, again, is responsible for technology, audio technology at Caesars Windsor. Mark is a senior designer, installation person at Solotech, which is a multinational sound company started in Quebec. My first professional gig was with Solotech in 1978 in Prince Edward Island, where we had a bunch of DC 300s, one of which went DC. So a bit of history there. Bob is another product, represents a bunch of different products in Canada, distributor for Digico, Meyer, Clearcom, and probably a bunch that I'm forgetting. And Rob manages, is vice president of Westbury National Show Systems, which is a full service, very integrated audio production company where they do sound, lighting, staging, video, other things that I'm probably forgetting, and they have a very big installations division as well. So he sees a lot of. So what are you up to now, Rob? Sorry.
Well, communications have made it a much smaller world now, so it's easy to work around the world. Shipping pricing has gone way down. Sea containers, we can move equipment anywhere in the world. So I've started to branch out and do projects in places that I'd like to see and stay in for a while. I just finished a project, actually an ongoing project for 6 months in Venice, where we shipped everything over there, and truly you can fly stuff into Venice, but there's no roads, so all the stuff comes in by boat on these, you know, mid-sized little freighters and cranes, drop the equipment off. I've got another project coming up in Qatar for World Cup, and I just finished something in Utah, mainly lighting oriented, but that's also what I do, and we got 2 Guinness World Records for that one, so I'm having fun with it now. Yeah. After you've done it for a long time, you start to be a little more choosy on what projects you work on and which ones you pass off to junior account managers.
So we touched on communication and signal transport. So when we started, all signal transport was over copper wire. And the interfacing of all of those pieces of equipment over copper wire was something that, for example, probably generated a whole bunch of AES meetings. Certainly the complications of having various grounding issues and how to ground it, where to lift the ground, well, don't lift AC grounds, but a lot of people did, but you shouldn't, but where to terminate pin 1, not terminate pin 1, how you terminated pin 1, whether stuff was balanced, unbalanced. This was a whole area of a great deal of concern, a great deal of research, and a great deal of time was spent tracking down ground loops.
That was a daily battle on shows, a daily battle. And now it's, when was the last time you heard a 60-cycle buzz in a PA system?
Okay, so I haven't said what I'm doing right now. So what I'm doing right now is I'm on the Taylor Swift Reputation Tour as the RF technician, and but I'm around. I'm going to try and get a picture of this up later on because the setup is enormous. It is absolutely huge. The distances involved for cable runs and so on are huge. But this is where we're going with the transport. It is all, and it's not one type of transport. They're using every type of transport. We're using Dante. We're using AES. We're using Opticore. We're using BNC over 75. What is that called? For
Matty.
Pro Tools. And
Matty?
so, yeah, we're
You-
using, Matty's
AVB?
in there. Every possible kind of audio transport that you can do is being used in some part of this setup. So, and my one observation is that I'm pretty sure that on a one-to-one basis, all of the time that we used to spend tracking down ground loops on copper-connected systems has been directly shifted over to time spent tracking down clocking problems and tracking down sample rate issues and tracking down various things, because it seems like about the same amount of time every day is spent troubleshooting how the signal's getting from here to there. So, yes, we've done away with ground loops for the most part. It hasn't been a total win in terms of freeing up people's time on shows. But anyway, so moving on. So let's talk about how we're getting audio around. Start with Rob at this time. What are you guys using for audio transport and, say, the Qatar job?
Well, as I've changed my job function at Westbury, I'm no longer really involved in speccing equipment. And I'd have to bring Alex up here to help me out with that. I've surrounded myself with great people and taken my hand out of the audio technical specification, and I will get behind a mixing board and run sound for an 80s comeback show once in a while, but I know we are using Matty and Dante, and
So you have people.
yes.
You have people. Bob, so Digico, Opticore.
Well, the shift really for us right now is to AES 67. That is where the broadcasters are going. That's where we're going. And when I say we, obviously we're influencers, but specifically Clearcom is all moving towards AES 67. A number of other manufacturers are doing that as well. There's variations of it. As far as Digico is concerned, Digico has always been their version of Opticore, and Matty, which is AES 10. So looking at AES 67 and looking at AES 10 and looking at Opticore, which is proprietary, and contrasting that with AVB, with Dante, I sort of you have to be of many minds because this is a very flexible situation right now. And when you said on the Taylor Swift tour that you have lots of different protocols being used, Mark, you've got optical cable, you've got Opticore, and you've got a massive amount of IT in the National Arts Center job.
Well, even more scary than the National Arts Center is we did the MGM Park Theater in Las Vegas, and between lights, video, motors, and audio, there were over 1,600 IP addresses assigned to equipment,
Wow. Yeah.
which is pretty scary to manage.
It's awesome.
And that was a project like the stuff with the Taylor Swift. You know, there were multiple platforms. Everything was clocked at 96K, and we actually had to do 3 Dante rings to get the 1,500 channels of audio passing around between the entertainment venue itself, the resort. There's feeds that go back and forth between the resort and stuff like that. And everything is pretty well job specific. Certain projects, you know, between all the amplifier rooms and stuff like that, it's Opticore, and then we've got, you know, if it's the Digico platform or Avid platform, there's AVB. There's Dante on-ramps and off-ramps for stuff. There's AE67 for digital clearcom. Multiple redundant loops. It's easy, but it's challenging at the same time. And like you spoke of, it just brings on a new focus in troubleshooting, a new focus in management of the networks. A lot different when pin too hot, everything spoke to everything.
Yeah, or it did until you plugged it into something that was unbalanced pin 3 hot but had an XLR on it. Just to interrupt, I'll get to you guys in a second, but this is something that you need to be aware of, is that very often it's not going to be, well, what system are we going to use to do this, to transport audio, but it's going to be what systems are we going to use. And it reminds me of years ago when you would get, like an engineer you'd call up because you had a question about a speaker system or an amp or something you were using, and you call the factory and you get a technician, and they go, well, they were never intended to be used that way. What are you even doing out there, you know? And you go, well, that's what we do in this industry, is we go out and find ways to push the envelope and to use things in ways that maybe people never intended to. Actually, we're really using stuff from the telephone company that was never intended to be, used this way. But, and so the same thing is that, somebody who's a Dante designer, or somebody who's a RF over fiber or fiber optic designer, or somebody might be thinking, well, this is how this is going to get used. And that may be part of how that gets used, but it may also be used with, 4 other protocols, and all of them have to be clocked to work together. That's kind of what's happening out on the Taylor Swift thing. It sounds like what Mark's talking about at the MGM installation. Over to you, David. How are you moving audio around the plant?
Well, we, with all the touring acts that come in, we have to have all the snakes, all the different snakes. So we've got Opticore, obviously copper, and BNC for the Digidesign platform.
So you've got house snakes laid in, so a touring act that comes in can just bring in their consoles or whatever.
That's the idea.
And you have to, instead of having one snake with a bunch of XLRs on it, you've got 4 or so with different protocols, different terminations.
Yeah, we've got Ethercon, like a 4-channel there, and lighting as well. And of course, we're always a little envious of the lighting world, because most times it's a Grand MA, and we're like, as you brought up, it's different consoles, different connections. I've got Maddie for recording. Basically everything.
How is the actual audio getting from the finished product getting into your system? Is that digital at that point? Is it?
Currently, we're still analog, but we're looking to go to AES and also Dante. So that'll be our next move.
And Trevor, oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Go.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
The issue of running multi-pair analog to accommodate a visitor How often is that happening these days?
It's getting less and less now.
What's a typical example of a guy comes
well-
in with an analog desk?
well,
Who is that guy?
I'll tell you, we just
No,
recently, Reba McIntyre came in, and that engineer had a Paragon, ATI Paragon. And of course, John McBride, when he comes in, he brings one of 8 of his Paragons. So it's funny because the second he plugs it in, you were talking about 60 cycle hum. Well, I said to his technician, I said, how do you fix that? And he goes, bang! And sure enough, it was fixed.
You know, just as an aside, I have serviced ATI Paragon consoles, and I never got a chance to mix on one. I would have liked to have had a chance to mix on one when I was mixing regularly, because they were really, in a lot of ways, the pinnacle of the analog mixing console. They had a gate and compressor on every channel, and 4-band parametric EQ, and all this. But they, as a manufacturing exercise, they never really quite nailed it. And there was all kinds of connectivity issues inside those things, and so on. It's too bad, because, again, it was practically, along with the Midas heritages, of course, it was practically like the peak of analog console design. But, and a lot of times, I've done manufacturing, Bob's done manufacturing, I'm not sure, but a lot of times, that's where the crunch comes, is actually finding out, for example, that the connectors that you want to use to join this circuit board to this circuit board are going to push the cost of the project out of the target price range or something like that, and you have to use tin connectors instead of gold or something like that. And right there, you've ended up building a reliability issue into your product that, you know, if you had your way, you wouldn't have. But the Paragons actually, one of those issues is that they used press-fit multi-connectors into the motherboard, and they're not soldered. And after a while, it's kind of like having a not soldered connection. So anyway.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, his hands were in that console in the back of the desk for most of the show, and you know, you question, you wonder, like, why do you put yourself through this? And I asked him, I said, you know, do you enjoy this console? He says, well, I'd rather drive a Cadillac than a fake one. You know, so I kind of admire that. But to answer Bob's question, no, most people are basically sending me their show file through email, and I'm plugging it into our house console or the console that they're bringing with them, either or. But the things have changed.
Well, yeah, and to be honest, like the first and second generation of digital consoles, a lot of them, again, I don't mix that often. I've mixed on a couple that were very common, very popular, and when I actually, and I had been on plenty of shows as RF technician where people were, you know, doing monitors or front of house or whatever on a lot of these, I'm not going to name them, but name brand consoles, and when I actually got to mix on one, I would go, is that what this thing sounds like? Like, I could not believe the sound quality of some of these things. They're definitely being used because of the convenience, the speed of changeovers, the recallability and all that stuff, but not because of what they sounded like. So if you had somebody that's dedicated to what they're listening to, I can see why they want to cling to an analog console like that for longer. That said, every generation of digital sounds better than the one before, and it's getting to the point where if somebody asked me to mix something, I think I would actually go take a study up and learn how to use that particular console, and I would think about getting back in again.
I think for the longest time, the whole digital console race was about who could pack the most features into a desk at a given price point. And in the last maybe 2 or 3, 4 years, you've seen people stray away from that now, and it's getting back to more about the audio quality than the actual features.
Yeah, although interesting, like you had a lot of history with a Novason, which was an early digital console, and they actually made the decision to not pack a whole bunch of features in there, but basically have it be preamps, EQ, and faders and sends. and look where they are now. You know? Sorry, so Trevor, we're using D&V amps, D&V speakers and amplifiers on this job on the Taylor Swift tour, and I haven't looked at the back of them too much, but I believe that the I/O is AES.
Correct. Yeah, so we have a standard in the industry now of AES 67 on that side of things, but when we struggle to have that standard in the higher channel count when we need to be able to transport higher channel counts. And there's Dante options, there's AVB, and there's a need for a standard protocol to be able to integrate all these multiple systems together. And AVB is what we're pushing for as that new standard, and specifically the Milan format. And it was actually launched at Infocom this year in an alliance with D&B and L Acoustic and Meyer Sound to try to be able to set that standard of a protocol so everybody is able to talk together in the digital realm. And that, it seems to be catching on, and with everybody driving in that same direction, hopefully we can have that standard moving forward that we all need to be able to transport these large channel counts.
Yeah, so this is the thing, and large channel counts, I mean, I'm not even sure how many inputs we're using, but the same company that's doing this tour is also doing the Beyonce Jay-Z tour, and somebody told me that like just the number of inputs they have, because it was one of those things like she has her band and he has his band, and so they both had to have their band. So it's into the hundreds, like well over 114. It's higher than that. It might be 200 and some odd, or 256, or a lot of inputs. And the thing is it's that kind of if you build it, they will come kind of thing. And as if you put that kind of transport ability of, you know, if you came up with a snake system that would carry 114 channels, you would take it out to a show and the producer would say, oh yeah, I need to do one more thing where we want to have this mic down in the dressing room for this gag, and that's your 115th channel. Like there's always going to be some kind of pressure to use more than what's already there. So the more that we the more capability we build in, the more demand there will be. It just seems to be like a given in the industry. While we're on transport for a minute, a couple of observations that I've made is it used to be that say a 56 channel copper snake was somewhere around that diameter, a big piece of wire. A piece of fiber that you can carry probably easily 4 times that, 256, maybe more, I'm not sure, is not even the diameter of my little finger. And so, for example, if you had to put a 100-meter, 300-foot, 56-pair snake in a truck, that was something that weighed probably, what, 400 pounds, 300 pounds? Fiber weighs nothing by comparison, 20 pounds or something. But when you start doing that, there's a lot of eggs in one basket. And also, again, when you have this interconnected setup with the Dante and the Mate and AES and all that stuff, and again, it all has to be clocked, and that means that your master clock signal has to be transported, and that's on 75 ohm BNC, so, which is still copper. But the trade-offs are you get this incredible interoperability, but the other trade-off is that you get potential for single points of failure, like a clock failure, just having the whole system just go. I heard something go by on the radio night before last of something about one speaker or one amplifier in one of our side hangs had lost sync, and the front of house engineer, this was before the show, front of house engineer was walking around and he could hear that. I don't know what it was, I didn't hear it myself, but he could hear it, and the system tech went and checked it, and yeah, one of the amplifiers had lost sync. So restored sync, everything better. But there's a lot of eggs in one basket with this. So just for example, multi-pin audio cables typically had a cover on the front, and rock and roll touring guys don't want to know anything about that cover because it slows down the teardown, slows down the setup and all that stuff. So they're always left hanging until they break off, and then they end up in the bottom of the road case if they're not thrown away. I used to actually use the covers, and I actually used to mate the unused covers together on the theory that if they're supposed to keep dirt out of the end of connector, I want to keep dirt and water and everything out of the covers while they're not being used. It's not popular. With optical cables in particular, they all come with covers. Use the covers, because if you get anything in those optical cables and they start to not work properly, you can really, really, really lose the whole ball of wax, everything. So those are the trade-offs with these, miraculous new systems that we have available to us, is you can do way more with them, but they're much more tightly tied together, and if something fails, maybe everything's going down. So,
Let's see.
where are we at? We got like another 25 minutes or so. We're going to 10:45. Is that what I heard? Somebody? Anybody? Yep. Okay. Okay. Let's say, what do you think has been the biggest single change in live sound in the last, let's say 20 years? And we'll start with Mark.
Obviously, I think the digital consoles was a big change for everybody. Having all that functionality within one resource was a huge game changer.
Spelled the end of the effects rack.
It certainly did.
Rock
And
pack.
the dynamics and everything else.
Yeah.
And I think another big thing was the reintroduction of the line array source. I think was a big game changer in the live market.
Yeah.
In theory, it wasn't new technology. You go back to the Shure PA columns and stuff like that. But I think the patent of that first high-frequency driver with the line array concept, I think was a big game changer for everybody. And it's gotten to a point now where it's the buzzword. Even if it's not the right tool for the job, that's what people want because it's the in thing. And I think those two things are the biggest. And just to tie everything back together to the old days, all this new technology, digital this and digital that, the math is still the same. You can't change the laws of physics. The same rules apply, the same formulas apply. It's just we're doing it in a different way now.
Yeah, and we have a lot more tools in our tool belt.
Exactly.
Bob.
Well, carrying on with the line array and adding to it control, and we're now at the point where we have individual amplification on every driver in a single loudspeaker. We have DSP associated with that amplifier, and that is allowing a lot of manipulation to take place. It's manipulation that people are beginning to understand. Manufacturers are beginning to promote and make it possible for their customers to access. So it started, I guess, first started with cardioid subwoofers. In some cases, a single subwoofer that was set up as a cardioid subwoofer. So the
Sorry,
low frequency.
Let's just stop for anybody that's not up to speed on that. Cardioid subwoofers, the idea came around because one of the big problems with these big rock and roll sound systems is a huge amount of bass wash that would get back onto the stage. And so the quest for cardioid subwoofers began in a way of not have that get onto the stage and muddy up the works up there. So very quickly, what Bob's talking about, taking a single speaker, is if you have like an array of 3 subs and you take one of them and turn it around, face it back toward the stage, and I think invert the polarity. I'm not sure, I haven't done this myself, but in any case, you create a cancellation zone behind there so that you're canceling the low frequencies that are going onto the stage instead of adding to them. So that technology has been developed into where now single boxes either have a driver dedicated to that or that kind of thing. Back to you, Bob.
Thank you. So, as an extension of this, it's possible to build for example, a low-frequency array that not only, that you have pattern control over. So controlling the pattern of low frequencies is a very challenging thing to do. And in some cases, for example, noise abatement in neighborhoods, it's a necessary thing to do. And so we now have the technology to do that, and that extends upwards in frequency to the ability to control full arrays. It takes a lot of processing power. It takes a lot of money, but those costs are kind of coming down, and what's filling the void are interest in being able to manipulate the dispersion pattern of a loudspeaker system. Then I think maybe the last thing is something fairly recent with loudspeakers is infrasonics. So, in the bad old days, what was tremendous low frequency? What was the frequency?
40 hertz if you were lucky.
Yeah. And people would listen to 120 hertz and go, amazing bass, amazing. Obviously, they weren't amplifying upright acoustic basses. That's tremendous bass, in my opinion. But we've now got a better understanding, a much flatter and lower distortion, low frequency response. And now that we've got that going for us, I think DMV has a very low frequency subwoofer.
Yes, definitely Infrasubs.
Yeah, and Meyer Sound does as well. So this is infrasonics. This is below 20 hertz. This is below audible frequencies. And you may ask why.
Yes, please do.
It's all about the feel.
And we've done a lot of experiments, and they've been very interesting. I would say that the question why still remains.
To just address that, I would like to address the young upcoming sound people in this room. When we were starting out, one of the challenges was getting enough bass. There is now, in any system you care to set up, there is enough bass. There is more than enough bass. And as young sound engineers, I'm looking at you 3 over there and anybody else, is that you now need to take note of the style of music that you are mixing. And there may be many, many, many situations where you do not need to use all of that bass. So, for example, if you're mixing, say, Sarah Harmer or something that's sort of a new country act or something, you do not need the bowel-moving kick drum and bass guitar. And that's what a high-pass filter is for. So you actually high-pass the kick drum and have it sound like it actually sounds like on the record and not in a discotheque. That's my digression. Rob?
I remember having that discussion with your brother at a Manteca show once, where you would often do sound for Manteca, and I filled in a few times, and I think I had too much bass for him.
Oh. So, okay, where were we? We were on, what's the newest, the single most important
DSP.
DSP, yeah.
In a word, you know, I think it's sort of evolved everything. We've touched on line array, we've touched on digital consoles,
Yeah.
connectivity.
Uh,
It's helped us with truck pack, truck weights, PA system sizes, budgeting on tours. We can get that much more into a truck. Time-wise, when you're patching front of house, it's not hours, it's hopefully.
Yeah, minutes, yeah. Mike Noonan, you made some sort of sign to me which I did not interpret. What are we, are we supposed to be wrapping up?
No, the sign was simply that now would be an appropriate time if you were getting close to the end to open to questions, if in fact you wanted to
Questions from
permit
the
them
audience.
before the time elapsed.
We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. So, David?
enough.
I think virtual sound check and instant recall has basically been a gift for audio engineers. You know, in the recording world, in the DAW world, you can, you know, listen to a mix and think you're doing a great job, walk away from it, come back with fresh ears and say, I don't know what I was doing. I think that's true in the live world where, you know, you can record however many channels in the monitor world, separate from the front of house world, go back and make sure, you know, the mix is what it should be. And trying to do that in the analog world, it just didn't happen. I remember being part of some mixes in recording, and you got like 5 guys, okay, turn up the reverb at this point and, you know, kick the snare up at that point. And we just, in the digital world, we have that luxury now, and it really is a gift.
That's a very good point. The Taylor Swift show, to my knowledge, is recorded multi-track in at least 4 separate places every night, which is the monitor engineer that does her mix and the background singers, the monitor mixer that does the rest of the band and everybody else. They both have Pro Tools sessions. There's a Pro Tools guy who's the playback but also recording guy, and then I believe it's also recorded at front of house. So everybody has that ability to do the virtual sound check where they can actually play back actual tracks of the band playing. And a situation where that came in really handy was her monitor engineer was called away on a family emergency at one point. They had to shift guys around, and somewhere in the day 2 of that process, it turned out that I was the only person on the crew, in the audio crew, that was listening to her mix. And when they moved the guy that did the band mix over to her console, he was kind of like, mm. And we put up a virtual session, and I listened to it. He mixed a little bit, and I said, well, try this, try this, try this. And between the two of us, we kind of figured out what the regular guy had been doing. And, you know, that was from having that resource available to us, because otherwise it would have been just a lot more trial and error. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, we talked about, you know, the advancements of line arrays being probably one of the biggest advancements in recent years. And Mark touched on the point that it's a tool in our toolbox, and it is a great tool for the right application, and point sources are still a great tool for the right application as well. And the advancement of design and simulation softwares to be able to make those proper educated decisions to make sure that you're using the right tool for the right application. We're at a point now where we look, you know, back in the days, you're looking at a horn, top cabinet, and you have 90 degrees of dispersion, so you're standing in the room and kind of, I'll go over here. And now we're able to design and simulate these systems within, you know, tolerances of plus or minus 3 dB over 100-meter throws, and compensate for atmospheric conditions and geometry changes throughout the room, and be able to simulate that all offline ahead of time to be able to do your deployment. And if you're able to do your deployment accurately, you can achieve these great successes and integrate that into your workflow so that you're able to do that efficiently, rather than spending hours trying to get that sub in the right spot.
And or putting it up and getting it wrong.
Exactly,
And
putting it
having-
up 3 times.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very, very good point, that the modeling and so on. And the flip side of that, though, is the fudge factor is gone. There is no fudge factor because, I remember the first time I encountered this on a Manteca gig at some club in Newmarket, and I got up there and they had this newfangled Adamson system with a MH225 high cabinet, which was really the first cabinet that I've ever encountered, and it might be one of the very first cabinets that had pattern control that really controlled the pattern. It basically went where it was pointing and nowhere else. And since this was yet another misdesigned club installation, very wide club, one MH225 aside, and it was like, in the old days, you could just kind of put them somewhere where you would get something everywhere. And in these things, no. It just goes where you point it. And another example, when I was on the Shania Twain tour a few years ago, one night one of the system techs hit a button that turned off a single cabinet in the line array. It happened to be the one that was pointed at front of house. And the mixer was like, he had to go to headphones because it was covering that riser about this size, one cabinet in the line array. That's where it went. And, if it had been the one above it or the one below it, a section of audience below or behind would have lost it. So fudge factor, gone, not there anymore. We should open this up to questions from the audience.
I'm going to be bold since I'm one of the keepers of the microphone and start off the first question that relates directly to your fudge factor point, which is the four-letter word that we all hate the most, which is technical support. Good, bad, otherwise, comments?
I'm not quite clear on the question. Are we for or against technical support, or are we...
just comments. Good, bad. What's bad about it currently? What's good about it?
You mean like when calling the manufacturers and so on?
Yeah. Where are the disconnects and where are the wins with gear support?
I think it's like everything else in this world, it's dependent on, which manufacturer you're trying to get the tech support out. Some are way better at it than others. For the most part, most of the main players in the game, that's one of the reasons they're the main players in the game. And I think when you get to that level, there's three models or three manufacturers that can do every job. And I think a big portion of your decision-making process now in which way you go, whether it be a speaker manufacturer, console, amplifier, whatever, I think a big factor now is the support and the relationship you have with those manufacturers now. Most of them are well versed in what they sell. Most of them have full-time technical people on board, and whether I'm doing a project with Meyer or a project with D&B, I know there's people I can count on through that to get that support we need through the project. Yeah. And I think that's, like I say, with three people being able to provide you with equipment, the equipment becomes secondary, and it's the service support both before the project, during the project, and after the project. Yeah. I think huge factor in the decision-making process now.
Yeah, and there's two factors to that. One is, first of all, boy, do you need it, because generally all these things that we're talking about are really computers. So yes, you do need the technical support. And so one side of it is the intellectual technical support of being able to get somebody on the phone or an email or something that knows what they're talking about. And two is the logistical technical support. If you're dealing with a company that just does not have their logistics chain together, where you say, okay, I figured out that this is what's wrong, can you get me another one? And they go, well, you got a container coming from, no. Yes, we can have one to you tomorrow, kind of thing. So those are two things about technical support. Anybody else on anything on tech support?
Yeah, talking specifically of support from a manufacturer, it's a key point if you're going to be considered one of the top 3. Our support department is probably larger than our sales department because it's a small industry. Everybody knows each other. If there's a bad result out there, you'll hear about it way more than the good result. And you want a good result every day. And the other factor that comes along with that support is also education and training to ensure that everybody is familiar with the new technology that you may have and properly trained and educated to be able to use it. So the support requests go down, but also there are more educated support requests that you can get to quicker and more effectively rather than an education every time there's a call that could be a 5-minute conversation turns into an hour because the education wasn't there, right?
Yeah, another good point. And because the thing is again, with great power comes great responsibility, and particularly with things like line arrays, boy, can you do it wrong. Like if you don't do it right, you can do it wrong. And as I was saying, because they're so directional and their coverage control is so accurate, is that if you don't point a box at a certain point in the audience that you should have one pointed at, there's not going to be any coverage there. So you can really screw it up. So and all of the line array, I don't go to these things, but I see the emails all the time. You know, we're having training in your town, or you know, you've bought one of our systems. It comes with a 5-day training seminar for whatever, and they're all doing it because they have to do it. Because if you don't do it, it's going to be wrong. So, anyone else on tech support?
Or if you point a box where you don't want sound to be, like a reflective surface, and it bounces straight back, it could be just as bad as not having a box aiming at an audience member. But tech support has changed a lot in the era, you know, when I started out, where we had manufacturers that would deny a problem. And we weren't as connected then, so you couldn't check with other companies. Now we're seeing way less of that. People are collaborative, and if it's a new problem, you know, we're seeing a lot more communication with people trying to discuss and figure out how to solve it.
See, Rob and I can actually do this in harmony because it was Westbury, for example. We discovered a lot of these things that were, and the thing is, well, we've never heard that one before, right? You get that all the time. Should we take another question from the audience?
Got one over here.
Yeah, okay.
I noticed the panel didn't much comment on the changes in sound analysis tools over the years.
And sorry, in what?
Sound analysis tools.
Oh, sound analysis tools. Yes, those are quite developed. Mark?
I think as computer processing power gets stronger, you're able to crunch more ones and zeros. I think obviously they get more accurate. Going back to an earlier statement I made that kind of ties things together back to the old world, that information you're getting is only as accurate as you're interpreting it. They're not the be-all and end-all by any means, but they're definitely in the stuff we kind of do now. It's definitely, you're right, it's a tool that we can't do without. And just a perfect example, at the National Arts Centre project in Ottawa right now, I have a kit with 16 microphones deployed right now as we speak to do exactly what you're talking about. But it all boils down to the computer power, and the DSP is the same thing that Rob talked about. You know, and Trevor with the DSP prediction softwares and stuff like that. As computing power gets up, you can crunch more ones and zeros. All it's doing is math. It's just crunching numbers. And as you get better processors, faster processors, the more accurate this stuff can be.
It is math, but it's also art. And we can't forget the art part of it. Yeah. We've got lots of amazing systems techs, but we also need to keep our ear training.
Yeah. Absolutely. You need to know how to apply this stuff. Absolutely. And the same thing, you know, the analysis tools need not be expensive. The Studio 6 digital apps for the iPhone, iPad, that platform are phenomenal. And even by themselves, you can get some very good results. And then they also make measurement microphones and interfaces and so on that you can up your game in that regard. But yeah, there's a lot of that information is available. We have another
Something on that side?
question. Yes, yes.
You haven't spoken too much about the corporate boardroom environment, marketplace. I'm an old dog in the AV integrator space, about 40 odd years. I'd be interested in your take on trends and infrastructure, et cetera.
That technically doesn't come under the rubric of LiveSound. So, what?
Are they dead in the boardroom?
Oh, and corporate boardrooms.
It does.
You know what? I didn't write this slide, so I stand corrected. But we could say, to fudge that a little bit, to say all of the LiveSound things that we've been talking about certainly carry over into corporate LiveSound. And to address your question specifically, again, the DSP developments in auto mixers in particular are, and bigger one yet, I think, is the steerable ceiling array microphones from Shure, and I think there's another company that's making them now. That world, and I have swum in that tank a little bit. It's not my favorite place to be, but the biggest problem that I ever encountered in any of those situations was getting the sounds of the people around the boardroom table either into the speaker system or down the phone line. And there's some huge strides coming along. Again, these steerable ceiling arrays are probably the biggest innovation in that space in probably 20 years. But again, DSP having the ability to configure these auto mixers and so on to be able to accommodate people around the table, because basically there's nobody operating that stuff, and at best it gets handed over to the IT department, which is usually, at best it gets handed over to the IT department. So is that good? Okay. Yeah.
We got time for one more. Rob,
Okay.
over there.
Hi. Quick comment and then sort of a question. David, regarding the Paragon thing, I probably would have responded with, notwithstanding that he was a client, I'd rather drive a Tesla than a Cadillac. Regarding redundancy in our new world of IT connectivity, it's actually, you've got more choices and more possibility for redundancy, and that includes with clocking systems. But the complexity for most audio guys, you need a Cisco network administrator to organize all the various flavors of boundary switches and transparent clocks and all that kind of thing in your IT infrastructure. But you can actually have a lot of redundancy and multipath in a network system, including for AES 67. And I wonder how any of you have had any leading edge sort of installations using those types of technologies at this point?
All of them.
Mark, do you want to
Answer this one.
A lot is dependent on the platforms you're using and stuff like that. Most of in terms of the network switches and stuff like that, and in terms of their clocking within the audio system, let's call it, most of that work is done by the audio manufacturers in terms of what switches they've done their tests on and which ones they approve and which ones they don't. Sorry. Certain switches you have to make modifications for, go in and program certain things in terms of QoS and stuff like that, what it prioritizes and stuff like that. But for most of the low level to lower high level stuff, it's self-contained within those parameters of the switches. When you get into the higher level stuff, the project I spoke of earlier was 1,600 network IP addresses. That's all kind of managed by a separate IT department. try and keep things within the scope of what we're comfortable with.
Thank you. And I see that it's actually now 3 minutes over, so I think it's time for us to say thank you to our panelists, guys, for taking time out of your very busy schedules for coming. Thank you guys for showing up. I believe that I'm going to be doing a more in-depth look at the Taylor Swift Tour RF situation for our December meeting. So just teasing that, you might want to come in December. I think back over to you, Michael.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Ike, thank you for that. That was fantastic. I don't think there's anything as fearsome and sort of visceral as standing in front of a system that you guys have deployed. I mean, LiveSound is the thing that sort of a lot of people think first of when they think of our community and our discipline, and there's nothing really, I mean, short of maybe standing on the conductor's rostrum in front of a symphony or maybe a big pipe organ. I mean, there's very little else than a big sound system that's going to sort of rattle your bones. And for me, there's also nothing that makes me pucker any more than just the thought of even having to get anywhere near what you guys do for a living. So thank you, please, because for all of the joy that LiveSound has brought me, it terrifies me to even get within 10 yards of it. So thank you for everything that you and your community do.